No, it's fine. That's just the way we start here on the Kayala Conversations. So today we're going to talk about the work that you did with your students at Yale for a new capital city for Guatemala, and I think that there's a lot of relationship with the conversation we had about Washington D.C. just last week or so. So can you describe? Can you start? How did you begin the project?
Well, I have been working in Guatemala on that since 2003, and I got to know the Guatemala city, which has huge problems as a metropolitan, because it's lacking in metropolitan infrastructure, but it has several million inhabitants, of which over 2 million travel every day into town for work. So you can imagine the state of traffic. It's absolutely catastrophic. And so that is one problem. I did a sketch master plan how this metropolitan infrastructure could actually be created, because there's a chance Guatemala City is built on a series of mesas, of table mountains, table hills with canyons cutting them into these smaller segments. And these canyons are largely free, and therefore one could establish like a metropolitan infrastructure, just like in Washington D.C., Rock Creek Highway or whatever it's called.
The Parkway. Yeah.
It's fantastic to have heavy traffic in a town, which becomes at the same time promenade and so on. That is one problem. It's a huge suburban problem. The other one is that the very notion of politics is heavily linked to the architecture which was built in the 1970s under dictatorship of General, I forget the name, but the architecture is certainly cannot be forgotten because it's so awful and so ugly, and it occupies the very heart of the city in a campus with including national and municipal institutions, ministries, and so on. So I thought, because modernism won by tabula rasa, by declaring the war on the world. Modernism has largely, as far as architecture goes, destroyed the world which people like. And so I thought we have to do kind of revenge operation. We're just going to destroy what destroys us. We're going to create the tabula rasa here. It's about a 50 to 60 hectare area. We just create a void and build in that void a marvelous small new capital for Guatemala, with a new presidential palace, a new Congress, a new parliament and new judicial, and then transform it into a real town so that people who work there can also live there. And then students, I had 10 students and fantastic assistant, George Knight. We traveled here. We lived in our project in the first hotel, which was built in Kayala, and were well received. And in our Azaria, it's kind of a meeting place, beautiful meeting place designed by Richard Economakis, professor at Notre Dame University. We met people from town and interesting teachers who had been teaching Pedro Godoy and Maria Sanchez. And we discussed this, and it was a very interesting occasion together with our client that I found for the first time that we sat in this very vast hall. We were about 25 people, and the hall was full. It was an important occasion, because the horrible thing is when you have to talk to few people and many empty chairs. So we were very well treated here, and we visited this Centro Civico, as this called. And we studied the buildings, and I had my own pangs of conscience as a good Catholic, how to demolish so much useful buildings, but they are so ugly. And then later, after the project, we met the minister, and he told us, don't worry, you don't need pangs of conscience because all the buildings we have here are not according to the seismic codes. So they have to come down sooner or later. They're in terrible shape. So, but then the idea was that we create this new capital city, which, because the perception of politics is the same here, which Europeans have about Europe. All European institution buildings are housed in Brussels, Luxembourg, and Strasbourg in the most awful, ugly, abstract, and obnoxious buildings, overscaled, without charm, and so on. Yeah. And the same here. So I thought just by that really once the state and the authorities, they promoted modernism, architecture was lost because they were upheld as the examples of what other private enterprise should follow. Instead, I thought if we are wasting money in taxes, at least that they should be spent like the church used to spend their, their money they received from indulgences, they spend on fantastic architecture. And whether you believe the Catholic theology or not, you can love Catholicism because of its buildings and its art. And it's the same with, it's very important for institutions, I think, to present a respectable and also an elegant, beautiful face. What we talked about, imagine that the Capitol building in Washington was replaced by some kind of a junk space, and junk architecture would just totally destroy the little respect there is left in America for those institutions. And so then the students, we were informed, we traveled also to Tikal to study, to get the atmosphere of Maya architecture, and we visited some villages, particularly to understand the vernacular here. And then every student had to do a lexicon. We visited also Antigua, which is the best preserved and often reconstructed city in Guatemala. So we had, of 10 students, 6 had to study Antigua in a lexicographical way, that is to record the details and make a lexicon of parts, which is now a very much used technique by, as you know, by new urbanists and traditional architects. Because when the interesting thing about traditional architecture is that when you go, as a Frenchman, you go to China, you record Chinese architecture. You can build Chinese architecture if you have talent within 6 months, whereas when you go as a Frenchman to China, study Chinese, after 6 months, you mumble nothing comprehensible. Yeah. Because architecture is a universal language. So 6 students had to study Antigua. So we had this fantastic dictionary of parts. 2 persons wanted to study, or I encouraged to study Art Deco, which is something in a style which was the last classical and vernacular style, which is still underestimated. Many great architects now practice it, like Jack Robertson, who just died, good old friend. He has done beautiful buildings. David Schwartz has done fantastic performance center in Las Vegas in the most virtuoso and accomplished Art Deco style. It's an architecture which spread around the world in no time in the 1920s, starting from an exhibition in Paris, the Art Deco in 1925. And without any theory or ideology, it became a world architecture which was practiced in New Zealand, in China, in America,
in Jerusalem, or in Israel as well.
Yeah, in Israel, even in Moscow, it transcended ideological differences.
Can I just say, our friend Jeff Dyer practices Art Deco in Louisiana to Calgary too.
Wow! Yes, yeah. Jeff. I met Jeff in Banff, I think, also, and in
Anyway, sorry.
It's fantastic style. I tried to use it for Miami University, but I was not allowed to go the full way.
Yeah.
Because not only is it incredibly interesting surface work, with minimal effort, with minimal expense, you can do spectacular effects.
Yes.
And then with a bit of color, you have seen the revival of the Miami beach, which was a ruin in the 70s, and now it's a jewel. So two people should study that, and they did lexicon of it, which is more difficult than actually classical architecture. One person had to study, no, two persons had to study Otto Wagner and study it in a lexicographical way. And one person had to study, that makes 11, maybe I had 11, and one person had to study Corbusier. And so that in order to avoid this kind of fanaticism, you know, the good and the bad, the modernist and the traditionalist, no, we don't believe in that. You can be a good modernist if you do the right kind of urbanism.
Right.
You can do a beautiful town. Unfortunately, the modernists don't do it well, so we have to show them how to do it. So, and then we then had, we did these projects. Every student had to do 1 or 2 public buildings, depending on his ability, some urban furniture, and then several of the typical palafitos, which we introduced here, which I explained the other day, the Roman palazzini now, which is the most, I think it's the most interesting building type to make real high dense urban environment, which is not oppressive.
Yeah.
And so they had to exercise this, and I had, was the year I had the best students ever, actually. They all developed, were incredibly enthusiastic. And the final product, which I published, was really, there was stunning work in all the styles. And we then tried to publish this year, and it didn't go very well. I met the ministerial director who was looking after public works, and the president, there was very little enthusiasm there, because they already had a plan to demolish their buildings and move the whole government into different quarters and have a big skyscraper with the president sitting on top.
Yeah.
But I think it's, you know, it's so important that politicians of left, right, and center, and it shouldn't be, architecture shouldn't divide people. There is no architecture of the left and there's no architecture of the right. Left and right are actually, you know, people even have forgotten where it comes from. It was a geographical location where the French opposition, the Girondins, sat on the right and the Jacobins sat on the left of the assembly. It's a location, it has nothing to do, it's not a moral. Now it has become this moralist thing. If you don't do something the left, so-called left, agrees with, they call you right. Well, the right is allowed within the law. It's not against the law to have right feelings. Anyway, most people have some part which is on the left and some on the right and some in the center. You are never a complete person belonging to one party.
Yeah.
So I think architects have really to realize that the most important thing is to do the right type of architecture, the right scale, the right color, the right materials, do as much possible, go back to traditional local materials.
Can I ask you about that? For the Guatemala City Capital, I believe I saw in some of the language, and I don't know who wrote it, the idea of a white city, like the Chicago white city.
Yes.
And then you mentioned Antigua, and Antigua, in my mind's eye, is very colorful, very, you know, expressive in a color. What's your thoughts on? I understand that if you have really bad architecture, but you make it all one color,
White.
white, then you can get away with it. Any thoughts on the color for a capital city versus, you know, a common neighborhood?
Well, I think that color is really an important subject, but it is a secondary subject. Yeah. That as long as you have good materials, you can use, you know, if you have good brick or good stone, or it's best to use that in the most authentic and massive way, so that you have true construction. Yeah. Brings about a true aesthetic.
Right. So the marble that comes from wherever expresses the color of however that capital city wants to be. Well, then what about the idea of...
No, but I'm not finished, because there was a very beautiful book done about the Greek islands. Myron Goldfinger, I think she was called, or Goldsmith, I'm not sure. All the buildings were white. And they all look fantastic. If you go to the islands, you see a lot of ugly buildings, because it has suffered a lot of damage recently. as long as you paint it white, it's beautifully integrated, you know, with, and generally even when it's done in lime, it's best. But then color is something very subtle. Today we have generally a very low quality of medium taste.
Yeah.
And if individual developers start imposing their bad taste, it just does terrible damage. So I think white is a very good way to start.
Yeah.
And then inside we generally don't control, and also because we don't have authentic traditional construction. It's very difficult to have in a large, if you do large urban projects, you always, unless you are in a certain part of Florida where it's completely traditional to do a wooden construction, you know, balloon frame construction. But also Andres has introduced load-bearing construction in Alice Beach, but also there, because it's always a mix of construction, but it's very well done, and white is always good. And even when the architecture is a bit over the top, white is always a good basso continuo, ground base on which you can recreate a fantastic urban environment.
Yeah.
I think I mentioned Williamsburg, it's a fantastic example of the correct use of materials, because all the public buildings, the governor's house, the Capitol building, the church, the little justice court, are in brick with slate roof.
Yeah.
All the private homes and farms, they are in wood, painted.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the stables are generally in unpainted wood. So
Right.
you have this very simple principle, which produced fantastic language. You know, where even without insistence, you see what is a public building and what is private vernacular and so on. And once we establish such a discipline, I think most people have a sense of aesthetic if they encounter it, if they have the chance to get out of the world of kitsch, which they are often born in and have to shop in and go to school in. Yeah. But you know, the classical architecture of Yale University is incredibly appreciated by students. And it's not only the modernist masterpieces by Paul Rudolph, which people like, which is, to me, is an absolute horror. I would take them down. But this classical language talks to everyone every day, and they carry it around in their heart all their lives. And that is why in America, because the elite is basically still educated in beautiful buildings, that's what saved vernacular traditional architecture for the large American wealthy public, who generally live in traditional homes. Whatever politics. Huh?
Yeah. But did any of your students from this class, have they gone on to do anything? I've asked because I know some students, I believe from Notre Dame, or who brought you in to hire you to do the Kayala project.
Yes. They actually, Pedro and Maria, who took us around here also to Tikal and so on, they are fantastic students. They have, of course, our students, yes, I am still in touch with them. And you know, I'm now bad with names, but the last project I published, which is about the Justice Court, he had a man he was an assistant of Gavin, who was a New York commissioner for development, professor for development at Yale. And he had been told by other teachers, you are not good in design, you know, you should more get into development. He's very intelligent, very articulate. He became the best student. He just caught fire. And the Justice Court he designed, it's unbelievably good. You know, and all that, he had never done it before. Yeah. Within 3 months, he became like a master in it. Yeah. Other students who, you know, there were some who were less talented or had less exercise. So I recommended one of the Parliament building, they're all named in the publication, which I recommended more like an Italian fascist classicism, which is something which is relatively easy to approach, to learn, and then design quite well. Because that was the last phase of serious classical architecture in Italy was under Mussolini, you know, whether you like Mussolini or not. I mean, he was a killer and a criminal, but he let some good architects do some very good buildings, and which are still appreciated in Italy, the Palazzo della Civiltà. Italiana in the Eur in Rome is one of the most powerful buildings in the world. When I saw that the first time, I saw it when I traveled in 1966 with my deux chevaux, when I saw that building, I felt like embarrassed. It was so powerful. Why am I moved by a building which was built by a criminal regime? And I hardly dared photograph it.
Yes.
People are troubled now by seeing beauty which had been realized by criminal regimes. But that has been the case throughout history. Most beautiful buildings were done. Do you like the politics of Louis XIV? No, he was not a person. But Versailles is fantastic, and everybody loves it.
Yeah.
We don't need that amount of classical architecture to be happy.
Yeah. Yeah, that gets real quick though. Looking at your Palestina model, I believe it's been applied quite a bit at Kayala as well.
Yes.
My question is, did that come from your Pure Nord project in Munich back in 1983?
No, I started this when I went a lot to Barcelona in 1976. I was briefly invited to teach there and so on. And I found that the Cerdà plan for Barcelona, which is a famous extension and century extension of blocks which are 100 meter by 100 meter, more or less, with 30 meter deep buildings, are typologically an absolute nonsense.
Yeah.
So I did an article for a magazine, or I did polemical drawing, which we published in Brussels, and which was then also published by Boigas in Barcelona, where I divided the typical Barcelona block in 12 or 13, I forget, blocks, small palacitos. But palacinas were influenced by the idea of the Roman palacina, which I had seen a lot. Because when you fly above Rome, the historic center is very small, but you see all these little blocks, tiny, tiny little cubes over the hills. And when you are visiting them, the older ones are absolutely magic.
Yeah.
The newer ones are awful, but still architecturally very undistinguished, but still great to live in.
Right.
Because they have a nice corner room, they have a lot of balconies, and people live out there on the balconies in summer.
Yeah.
And so, but that was influenced, came really from earlier 1900s. In Italy, there was a lot of experimenting with these small blocks because the famous architect Piero Portaluppi, had done a competition for Milan, where he exemplified these small blocks done in the style of Adolf Loos, very stripped classicism, but which always fascinated me. And that was 40 by 40 meters, which is a bit too big to have really intense urban structure. But that influenced the plan of Rome, which was done by Giovannoni and Piacentini in the 1920s, which allowed villa areas to be transformed, villas to be replaced, often very nice villas, but they were replaced by these palazzini. And because of the lot size was a certain size, which was about 30 meters, so they could build up to 5 meters to the border, and that you ended up always with a block which was 20 by 20, 25 by 25. My Barcelona blocks were 24 by 24, and I exercised them with students at the Royal College, where I replaced Kent Frampton. He asked me to replace him when he went to New York. But we were all good friends then. It was fantastic. In the 70s were fantastic. We were teaching often in the same schools. I was sitting next to Peter Cook, between Peter Cook, Bernard Tschumi, and Elia Zengalis, who was a hypermodernist, but who had invited me to teach. Because all people who were interested in architecture were friends. And that is unfortunately then with the kind of neo-modernism taking power again in the 80s was then finished, because we became a real threat.
Yeah.
No, but the Palazzina, you can follow it. Basically, it was very powerful in Italy, starting in the 1920s. But you have the same in Ankara. For instance, you fly over Ankara, most of the buildings, the residential quarters are built that way. Yeah. You have them a lot in Tel Aviv. The Geddes plant for Tel Aviv had often similar blocks.
And that's the deco as well. It's done in the deco. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. What is new about the palazzinas we use is that they are no longer suburban, because they were a suburban model. And by introducing them really as an urban model, by creating passages through the blocks which are open to the public, you intensify the urban network, and you can have, instead of having, let's say, 400 meters of shop front in a typical Barcelona block, you have, I don't know, like half a kilometer of shop front, which of course increases the and the commercial value of land.
This isn't going to come out well because I drew all over it.
Not so close. Not so close.
Yeah, not too close.
Further away.
Oh, I know what to do. This was an idea that you had put forward for a main street in the U.S. West, these fit those sort of metrics you were talking about, where the main street buildings ends up being mixed use.
Yes.
Plazacinas, and there you create that walkway,
and the traffic continues. The traffic is not interrupted, but it frees a central pedestrian mall in the middle. Now that would work.
And this is what's being discussed today for trying to figure out how to make outdoor space for dining when we can't gather in our indoor space. So this allows the capacity of the buildings to double, because you can go outside and be away from other virus-carrying people.
It's good. This architecture is good for all season and all viruses.
Yes, and especially good in places like Guatemala or San Diego or Miami or Tel Aviv, that the weather is perfect, beautiful all the time.
But also what people don't understand, or what politicians don't seem to want to understand, is that viruses, they need us and we need viruses. Mm-hmm. And viruses are not killing viruses. They want to be with us, because without us, they will die. Yeah. And if you listen to serious virologists and epidemiologists, they tell you all the same story. There is no reason to terrify the planet about killing viruses. It's an absolute lie, and it's a monstrous crime against humanity, I think. Because these viruses, they come in waves and they will go away. There are, of course, people who are sick anyway and have some terrible disease will die with it, but they will die anyway. And so one should stop this panic that now public space has to be sacrificed because of the viruses, and that the suburbs would come back. They are unaffordable. Right.
Or that density, cities are in question now. But we're not, as said, we're not questioning prisons, and we're not questioning retirement homes, which are, there's a difference between congestion and density, which is just a measurement of place.
And the density of sick people, that's what counts, and not lock up children with crazy families. I mean, it's just mad.
That's my portrait. Well, we're at 30 minutes. I appreciate you taking the time to discuss this, and we'll do it again in a couple of days.
Great. Okay.